Okay, Peter went through the civil wars. We're going to talk about what Rome was like
Yeah. It was.
at the beginning of the New Testament period and through the New Testament. Wealthy families had disappeared. Most of the free landholders had disappeared. The rich people were the contractors. Why? Because Rome was into conquest. So what happens when you have to conquest all these lands? They need to be rebuilt. All these people that have those means, they become wealthy. The rich became richer and the poor became very poor. You'll see that when we get into taxes. They had a tremendous rise in slavery where nearly 1/2 of the population were slaves. Increase in criminality due to poverty, unemployment, and boredom. They don't say idle hands. And they had a lack of value for human life and a huge murder rate. And this is through the New Testament times. Lawlessness and corruption at all levels. And we kind of can relate to this. No amount of taxation could overcome the demands of the military and the needs of the poor. They could take all the wealth and they still wouldn't have enough. Decadence and depravity carried over into the Jewish society. And we've seen, if you've read through the New Testament, you see the things that Jesus spoke out against with the Pharisees. All of depravity. Religious leaders could not meet the spiritual needs of the people because, just like Jesus said, they themselves were blind and deaf. And here's what, into this environment, though, Jesus gave birth to his church. And it was corrupt, materialistic, intellectual, and a superstitious society, but he didn't have any worries about what was going to become. And the people were in need physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So that's kind of our overview. We've seen that map of the whole Roman Empire. Pretty much most of the known world other than over in the Far East. Roman government, the height of which began in 63 BC, as Peter had talked to, with the beginning of the Caesars. Two classes, just as a review, patricians, the upper class, and the plebes, lower class, but then they also fell into slaves, which was 50% of the people. So the other 50% were either poor or rich. King was elected. Now, he wasn't really a king. They declared an emperor or a dictator. The government established a massive network of highways to connect all the major cities of the world. Roman emperors maintained law and order, defense, and actively engaged in conquest. And that took most of their money. In addition to that, they had civil programs in place for everything. Administering justice, taking care of the poor, building programs, and really what their goal was, just like the Caesar kind of wanted to make himself a god, they wanted to transform the world in the image of Rome. That was like the pinnacle. And just as Peter had talked to you, Augustus was likely the best of the Roman emperors. He created civil programs, police, fire, water workers, building inspectors, tax collectors, sheriffs. He got rid of pirates, which made all the transport of things on the seas much safer. And he attempted to make Roman laws uniform, humane, and just. He didn't always do it perfect, but he made an attempt. What was Rome like? Guess what? We have a city of incredible contrasts. We have these beautiful buildings, these aqueducts, and the Colosseum, and the forums, and then huge sections that were just decayed. Poverty, sewers, filth. So it had the nickname of both the Eternal City and the sewer of the Empire. I guess it depends on what street you're on. Inside or the outside of the place. It was bustling with activity and commerce, and almost anything from around the world could be purchased in Rome. Because it was just the center of everything. But at the same time, brimming with vice, corruption, lawlessness, poverty, the seediness of the underside. It had great amphitheaters, entertainment, games, gladiator fights, But it needed that, because people were bored, they were unemployed, they were restless. They were either gonna be in crime, or here's what, get them in the arena so that they could just at least sit there and be entertained. Today, we just do it with video games and movies. The rich indulged themselves, eating, drinking, and pampering, while the poor did whatever it took to survive. So, here's the question.
Describe Rome, or you describe.
That's what I said. How much has the world changed since that period? I mean, technologically we've changed, you know, your internet, but when it comes to the human side of the world, the part that deals with what man creates, because man is fallen, it's exactly the same. The nature of man hasn't changed. And you see the same thing when you went through the Greeks and you went through the Egyptians, Babylon. Now, slavery and citizenship. Seems kind of odd to say 50% of people are slaves. But here's what, when you conquer lots of nations, what are you going to do with all those people? Especially when you want to build thousands of miles of roads, and you want to build big buildings, and you want to quarry big heavy rocks. But it's not the form of slavery that we're become accustomed to. I mean, it's still slavery, and it was still terrible, but it wasn't it was an economic slavery. In other words, they couldn't afford to live, and they could live better as a slave. Because they weren't the worth of humanity. In most cases, they were teachers, they were accountants, they were doctors. But here's what, economic conditions, they'd lose their land, they'd lose their family. So the only thing they could do is sell themselves. And in many cases, the slaves lived better than the poor. Because what does a person that has a slave running their business want to do?
Take care of them.
They want to take care of the slave. They want to make sure he's fed, because here's what, they're sitting around watching, dancing girls and eating, and they don't want that business to fail. The merchant doesn't want his ships not to get to port, so they take care of them. And many slaves ended up very wealthy because they handled everything in the empire. And successful slaves were even given the opportunity to purchase their freedom. I don't know how many it happened, or how much it took, but they had an opportunity. This wasn't like our society before. I don't think ever could become anything but poor. Building an art. They engaged in massive building programs to make Rome the example to many nations. Monuments, temples, theaters. They expanded trade, commerce, all this to make Rome the pinnacle of the earth. The elaborate villas, the wealthy, if you had money. Roman baths, fountains, houses had libraries. And they were expert at road construction, bridge building, aqueducts. If you've been to Israel, you've seen where Herod the Great built aqueducts to take water from here to there. The Colosseum was designed to accommodate 50,000 people. In addition, underneath the Colosseum, they could warehouse thousands of animals, and they had elevators that would bring the fighting people or the fighting animals. It even had connected to the aqueduct so that if they wanted to show a sea battle, they could flood the whole lower level, and they could portray a sea battle. Here's what, so much for people without computers to do all that CAD.
Yeah.
And then they had artisans, they did murals, mosaics. I mean, we may say, we always look back and say, oh, that's so olden days, But man, they were incredible craftsmen. We may have power tools, for masonry or do this, but man, they did all this stuff with hand tools. I mean, they had some, power tools, not like we would think. They didn't work on if they wanted to cut cement or block, they didn't, have a diamond-bladed saw that ran with a big Husqvarna thing. No, but here's what, they got it done. Part of the Colosseum that's still standing, a giant aqueduct over the top of a river. And there's the Colosseum, where you can see that is what's underneath. where all of the animals would be, and that would have had a floor over it. Even at the top, it had covering to keep the sun off, just like curtains that would come out. Sculpture, art, frescoes. You know, if you're wealthy, you could have all the walls painted with that kind of frescoes. And if you go to Israel, you can see in some of the areas where they still have some of that in Masada, where it's still on the walls. This Herod the Great had lots of money. Roads, travel, transportation. The greatest road builders in the world. Well, we have some good road builders now, but in Michigan, our roads are terrible. Now, here's what, in Israel and in Rome, they were probably bumpy, but they lasted. They were just always bumpy. You know, if it's made out of cobblestone, it's kind of got a bump to it. But it stayed in place. And every major city was connected to Rome. The phrase, all roads lead to Rome, was really well known. Why was that? Well, if you're in a conquest, what do you need to get where? You want to get your troops to that place as fast as possible, especially when your empire is that big. You know, Peter talked about all the buffer states. Well, here's what, that didn't mean that they didn't have to reinforce them. It didn't mean that they had to say, hey, we need to meet them here before they get to this point. Plus, trade, if you want to go on the seas and you want to get wheat from Egypt all the way over to Rome, you need to be able to do it safely and efficiently. And here's why. The road system was a tremendous asset for expanding the gospel. And the Roman road actually consisted of 5 layers. I think we would do this in today's day and age. 4 to 6 inches of sand, 12 inches of stones and cement, 10 inches of concrete, 12 to 8 inches of rolled concrete, and then 8 to 12 inches of lava slabs all joined together. That's all right when 50% of the population is slaves. You know. And the Roman government ran one of the most successful postal systems in the ancient world. If you're fortunate enough to have money, you can use private couriers. When you travel, if you had money, you had a carriage, you had a chariot. If you were poor, like Joseph and Mary, they rode down to Jerusalem on a donkey. Jesus and the disciples, how'd they get around? They walked. Good thing they don't, you know, they would probably love to have grown up today because their parents would have driven them everywhere. Hey, you know, Mom, we need to go down to Galilee, or we need to go to Jerusalem. Oh, okay, let's go on the minivan. So what impact does all that stuff have on the gospel? Everything that Rome put in place. We talked about a little bit. Speediness. You know, when Jesus said, go out and take the gospel to all nations, they couldn't jump on the internet, but here's what, they could jump on the interstate. You know, when Paul, on his missionary journeys, he talked about, you know, going to Rome and going to Macedonia and going to Philippi. All these roads went to all these places. When they had to get the letters circulated through all the churches, they could get couriers, they could get the postal system. All this was in place. Here's an example of the road. It looks kind of small because I took a big picture and I shrunk it down, but it was actually in the picture, it's probably like 20 feet wide. And then there's your layers. Sand, cement and gravel, bigger rocks, other cement, and those big flat stones on the top. So it was probably bumpy, like a stone thing is, but it stood in place. It didn't do, you know, this piece cracked up and this big chunk. And you have a carriage if you're wealthy. I mean, that's a fancy carriage. Chariots, that's like a merchant ship. You could ride on a merchant ship. You just had to stay on deck and provide your own food. Education and literature. Basic curriculums were pretty simple. No home ec, no gym. Reading, writing, and math. And the only way they taught it endless repetition, memorize, memorize, memorize. And again, Roman citizens, if they had money, who did they let take care of education? And here's what, we'd say slaves, oh, that seems, but here's what, these slaves were teachers. So, it was kind of a, go ahead.
Steve, when I was in Rome, that was awesome. Like a month ago, I was there, and we were looking at all the Roman numerals on everything, and it was like, I'm so glad we didn't have to do math in Roman numerals. The Arabic numerals that we use, you know. I never really thought about that, but can you imagine multiplying? That's, you know. Anyhow, just a thought.
I don't think I can still get the metrics. And here's what, as the empire expanded, they took a more active role in schools. They created schools in the larger towns. They started paying the teachers. They're probably still slaves, but. And here's what. When girls were age 12 or 13, they were no longer in school, they kind of went home. Because what happened when they were 14 or 15? Married. So they got ready at home. Boys would go on and do advanced things, Greek and Latin, history, astronomy, poetry. Textbooks were the great works of the day. We were talking about Cicero and Seneca and all those philosophers and theoreticians. At 15 or 16, the boys were declared men. They became Roman citizens. 15 or 16, we can't get most of the kids today to get jobs or cars. Here's what, if you're wealthy, you could go on to university. Athens, Rome, Tarsus, Rhodes, Alexandria, study medicine, law, philosophy, languages. What type of family do you think Paul came from?
Wealthy.
Wealthy enough where he had gone to study with the masters in Judaism. Same thing, education for Jewish boys. They had a similar curriculum, but everything was from the Old Testament. They didn't go to the philosophical works of the Greek writers. Old Testament, they learned rituals of Judaism, they learned the Jewish traditions. And here's what, if they wanted to go on, they were trained by the rabbis, just as Paul was under Gamaliel. Some of the Roman philosophers, people who talked about Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Seneca, who was kind of a moralist. They all came out of that period. Now, what impact did this have on the spread of the gospel? What could end it?
Who could read?
For one, people were educated, so they could read in most parts. We also had someone like Paul who was smart. What do you think was bad though?
Conspiracy.
No, what happened, what did Paul face when he went to places like Athens?
Different
That's
No, but what when we talk about education and that stuff?
that's.
Overly smart people. People were educated beyond their intelligence, we could say. You know, when you talk about all these things, and they just like to talk, to hear themselves talk, you know, like the old philosophers. And he had the hardest time. It says he was so discouraged when he was in Athens, because he was there for the longest time and had no converts. Because all these people were educated throughout this thing. And sometimes that's a good thing, because here's what, now people can read and understand the Bible. But then also they can understand all this other gibberish, and they don't have discernment. So it's kind of a twofold impact. But it also allowed for those letters to circulate and to be read by all people. Entertainment. We like entertainment. The stage that had been set up by the Greeks with the tragedies and all these great epics had now become a way to calm the masses who were unemployed and bored. So what did it have to become as it does today? Vulgar, obscene, crude. Yeah, just, but they did have music,
Yeah.
lots of popular music. That wasn't really a common thing though. It was more for the wealthy people. They would have people come in the house and play music. Chariot races were very popular. The Circus Maximus, big, huge, open-air race, 260,000 fans would watch it. And many of them could get run right over on the side of the road by the chariots. But it draws crowds. It's kind of like NASCAR. People enjoy that. The gladiator fights in the arena and the Coliseum were very popular. Men versus beasts, men versus men. It couldn't get bloody enough almost. And here's what, over time, their appetites required more brutality, more bloodshed. And here's what, as Peter just talked about, Nero and Philippus, they were happy to give it to them. Because here's what, people in one location, happy watching a few people get killed, are better than them looting and burning and destroying the city.
The word amuse, means not to think. Muse means to think, and they were trying to get the people just to be amused.
Yeah, take their minds off of everything. In a lot of cases, they feed them, while they're there, throw bread into the crowd. And then, it's no wonder that there were cheers rather than protests when Nero would throw Christians to get eaten by beasts. No outright saying, oh, man, these are our brothers and sisters, these are... No, it was just excitement. And we kind of see that today.
Yeah.
This is an amphitheater. This is the outside of the amphitheater. That's the Colosseum. So, entertainment. Is it talked about anywhere in the New Testament? The entertainment, how it's infected the culture and people's behavior? Doesn't Paul talk about it in some of his letters? He talks about what's going on in Corinthian churches. How they're going back to those ways and the things that they used to do and how they're spending their time. Language. 4 prominent languages in the Roman world. Anyone know what they are? Latin, that's number 1, there you go. That's Roman literature, of course, mostly through northern Africa, Spain, Italy, Gaul, and Greek. Greek, that was the culture and educational language. Aramaic, this was the dominant language in the Middle East and the Near East, used by Jesus and the apostles. Classical Hebrew, this was the Jewish language for rabbis, a theological language, the scripture language. It wasn't really spoken or understood by most Jews. They would go and hear the Torah read, but that doesn't mean that they would have said what it was. They would only understand it from having been taught it in Aramaic by their parents.
Well, that was the same with the Catholics up until
Oh, yeah, the Latin.
several years ago when they changed it over to English. All the prayers were in Latin. I was an altar boy, and I would say these Latin words. I had no idea what they meant.
And so they knew them through the ritual. They didn't really understand the spoken language. So now what does that say about the expansion of the gospel?
Going everywhere now.
Now, what does it say about the people that expanded the gospel? Well, let me ask you this. Why was Paul the apostle to the Gentiles and not Peter?
Because he was multi-versed.
Peter spoke Aramaic. Who was Peter going to witness to? People in Judea. Paul, educated, he probably spoke all those languages. He had studied the Torah and everything in the original classic Hebrew. He spoke Greek because he would have learned that in school in Tarsus. likely would learn Latin too, because he was in the taking business that was, could be used for commerce and things like that in the empire. And Aramaic, it was the everyday language. So Paul not only did he have all this knowledge historically of the Judaism, but then he had all this knowledge and understanding of how the world worked. So you could say, despite his killing of Christians, God really formed him and raised him up to be the perfect messenger to deliver the gospel. Social conditions in the family. We don't have any issues like this today. Despite laws governing divorce, and Augustus really wanted to try to eliminate, a lot of things that were destroying the family, they had all these rules. Scandalous living was still the predominant thing. And you see it as Peter went through, this Herod wanted his brother's wife, and this one wanted this person's wife. Marriages were arranged for material and social advantage. Girls 14 to 15, boys at age 20. And they had elaborate funeral ceremonies in the Roman Empire. A lot of times they would actually pay people to mourn.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. How do you know if anyone even likes you? You don't, because you're dead. Roman law. It was designed to protect the state, the citizens, private property, and the social conditions that related to it. Kind of like our law. Are they successful? Here's what. Laws are as successful as man can be in its state of fallenness. Okay? They're still instituted by men, and men are not perfect. But here's what. It did greatly improve the status of women and slaves. Private offenses, they were given punishments that were designed to correct the wrong that had been done. Now, what happens if you did a public offense? What did Jesus do? He did a public offense. They were vindictive. Torture, crucifixion, burning alive, beheading, thrown to animals. He said he was king.
Last one said it was God.
Well, yeah, Pilate doesn't care if he says he's God, but if you say you're king, you're threatening Caesar. That threatens my job. God, hey, prove it. But when you say you're king, well then, that's going to affect my pension. I don't want that. So public offenses. Same thing, when Nero gets in power, Peter, Paul, Christians, the Christians burnt 2/3 of Rome down. We got to make a public spectacle of them. Let's put them on pikes down the main road and light them on fire. That's it. But here's what. They did create a stable system that was consistent from one place to another. So even amidst all the chaos, they tried to create a little bit of order. Now, again, how did Roman law impact Christianity? Where do we see it in the New Testament? Peter alluded to it with Festus, Felix.
Paul appealed to Rome.
Paul was a Roman citizen.
So he
was mistreated. So what did Roman law say? Any Roman citizen could have their grievances heard before Caesar. So that's what Paul used, Roman law. So we see kind of all these little things kind of woven in, so we kind of get a sense of how all these things that are in place were used. Agriculture, industry, and trade. Very different than today. The majority of the lands in the empire, all along that Mediterranean, they were fields, they were orchards, they were unbelievably fertile areas. What they are now is mostly desert. If you look at North Africa and northern Egypt, it's desert. North Africa had vegetables, fruit, cattle. Egypt, grapes, wheat, vegetables, olives. It had it before because it says when the Israelites were in exile,
They belong
they had these huge farming things. But do you ever hear about anything today on the news talking about all the great orchards in Egypt and all those areas? Well, I guess all of those things decomposed and became one of them. Italy had fruits and grains. Agriculture flourished throughout every part of the empire. Now, the small shops, again, which were owned by wealthy persons, were run by slaves. And most of the things were made by hand. They didn't have lathes and all those things to make bowls. They had to make them all by hand. So they were done little by little in small shops. There wasn't a Walmart or an IKEA. You had earthenware in northern Italy, paper and linen in Egypt. But most people were local small craftsmen. Jesus was a carpenter like Joseph. It would have been a small little family thing. You know, Peter was a fisherman. It would have been a small little family fishing business. It wasn't a big commercial thing where they had 50 boats and mining operations. All the precious metals were owned by Rome and carried out again as slaves. But here's what, things were taken because of that Roman network of roads and sea lanes. They were taken all over the world, into India, into China, all the way up the coast of Europe. Palestine was predominantly agricultural herdsmen and shepherds with fishing in Galilee. That's really the only place for fishing if you're not on the Mediterranean Sea. And in the area of Judea where Jesus was, most people were so poor, if they had one drought or one crop failure, they would lose everything. That's poor. Not only lose everything, you may starve to death. And the funny thing is it's not like you had a rich relative. The wealthy class is made mostly of Sadducees, which was a political class. You'll learn it and go through those in, I think we're going to talk about that in the last class, is the classes and all within Judaism. So now, how is agriculture and commerce reflected in the New Testament? Think of just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
fishermen.
What are most of Jesus' discussions about? Most of his
Farming.
parables.
Farming.
They're agricultural. He spoke in the way people understood. They understood what it was to plant seeds, to pick fruit, what fruit should be like. A tree that doesn't bear any fruit, any farmer knows, needs to be cut down. So it was a way of relating the message of salvation in a way that these people who were poor made sense. Hence the reason no one took a lunch either, too, when he did the feeding of the 5,000. Because none of them had a lunch to take. But it also gives you an idea of when Peter's followers followed him, they were giving up everything because they had very little. So to follow this teacher around for 3.5 years, what happens to your house? What happens to everything? You're either a fan or a follower. Okay. Taxes were a little high in the Roman Empire. They had a little problem with these building things. They just kept wanting more and more expensive ones. They had shipping charges, they had sales taxes, inheritance taxes. There was a direct tax paid on all property and land. And during New Testament times, Palestine was the most highly taxed nation on earth. No middle class, very few wealthy, the vast majority were very poor. The wealthy were Sadducees, the merchants, the moneylenders, and the tax collectors. Religious taxes, these will make your head spin. Just the religious taxes in Jesus' day. 10% of all produce is the main tax. Just 10%. All produce. And an additional 10% of all produce to be set aside along with the tithe of cattle for sacrifice. And an additional 10% every third year to be set aside for the poor. The firstborn of all animals were claimed for sacrifice. A charge for every firstborn child, and the firstborn of every unclean animal. First cake baked with freshly milled flour. To the temple. Part of all the wool collected at sheep shearing time. To the temple. And then an annual poll tax so that they could add on and repair the temple. So, if you had any money after, then you got the other taxes. Because Herod took a portion of everything for his building programs. He also charged a tax on everything sold in the market. Rome charged export and import duty on everything. So if you needed anything outside of your local community, shame. Plus, Rome collected city taxes, house taxes, road taxes, taxes on water, meat, salt. And they still didn't have enough money. Plus, Rome could also, if they wanted to, take tithes of agricultural products. I like this one too. They also charged what they called a frontier tax. And they considered every city gate a frontier. So anything that went in or out of the city was taxed. Hopefully our legislators aren't here to watch this. And additionally, tax collectors were corrupt. They were overseen by the procurators who were thinking about their pension, especially in the area of Judea where there was such unrest. But they usually added additional taxes. In other words, they cheated. And Jesus talks about that throughout the Gospels.
Zacchaeus.
Yep. Talks about cheating people, taking more than was due. He didn't say don't take what the government requires. He said you're taking more than what's due. So, what do you think life is like? Man. When it says Jesus came into a place that was lost and sick and hurting and hungry, they weren't kidding. You know, when he talks about, and he does the Sermon on the Mount, and he's talking to people they can understand what it's like to hunger and thirst. He's talking about hungering and thirsting for righteousness, but they can understand what it's like to hunger and thirst. To be put down and to be oppressed and money and banking. They had really nice looking money back then. If you had to get by the Caesar heads and all that stuff, it was very creative. Standard coin in the Roman Empire was showing coin. You see through Judea, the denarii and all that. The captive nations were allowed to keep their own coins though. So if you looked into Egypt and over in Carthage and Gaul, they had their own coins. So what became big business? Money change. I just think to recall somewhere Jesus was talking about money change. How they were charging these exorbitant rates and extorting the people.
For the sacrifices.
For the sacrifices. Because here's what, Jews that had been spread out over into Rome or into Gaul or other areas, they'd come with their currency. And they'd have to buy an animal for sacrifice. Well, they go, oh, well, we got to charge a duty, and that's only...
The temple had their own currency.
Yeah, so he wasn't upset that they were changing currency. He said, you're robbing God's people. Usury, exactly. And here's what, as Peter said, as the Caesars grew more and more corrupt, the coinage was propaganda. They'd put their face on it, they'd make themselves look like a god, they'd put military or political symbols on it. again, used to show Rome's power. Interest rates from 4 to 12%, if you didn't have to go to a private road. The catacombs. They didn't have much on the catacombs, but basically, these were outside of Rome. Did you go to the catacombs when you were there?
No, we could, but I had to pay extra.
Is it interesting?
There's 5 catacombs in Rome. The nearest one downtown was called Catacombs de Priscilla. The Romans knew where they were, so they couldn't, the Jews couldn't, or the Christians could not live there, but they did store their bodies of dead Christians in shelves, that are all since empty and are relics to the churches. And they would have their services there, more wide open area with arches, and they had their services.
Yep, so the catacombs were where the poor were buried, outside the city. But here's what, under Nero, he was killing so many Christians, they didn't have anywhere to bury them, so they would be putting them in these poor areas, in these underground vaults. And just as she said, eventually they would actually, in order to get away from this crazy man, they would have their services in the catacombs, in amongst all the dead. And here's what, good thing they were Jewish, because they couldn't even be in there. Because if they were religious leaders in Judaism, they couldn't be near any dead bodies.
Yeah.
Roman warfare. They were masters. They didn't invent siege warfare. The greatest siege the pioneers of siege warfare and terrorism were the Assyrians, but the Romans mastered it. They had elaborate machines. They had great mathematicians and inventors, and they created, massive crossbows that could fire a 12-foot long bolt, 2,000 feet. Imagine seeing that come flying at you when you're standing on a wall, especially because on fire. Catapults to hurl huge rocks. It's nothing compared to what we have now, because we have, on some of our bigger warships, they have a thing that can shoot several miles, or probably actually more than several miles, through the air, and it can hit a precise spot. But here's what, when you're a barbarian tribe, and you see all this come up against you, it's pretty formidable. And they had siege towers, tremendous things where they can get all their troops right up over the top of the walls and in. And they used tactics. They could form their ranks. They could take their expertly trained soldiers, and they could just take over all these people who, in many cases, were just ragtag bands. There's a big giant cannonball. There's ballista, it's called, that shoots the arrow. Siege tower. They are also experts at warfare on the sea. And here's what, there's a Roman column. All their shields interlock, and every man protects the man, part of the man next to him. They knew what they were doing. Yeah. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, and you've seen how when they're in the Colosseum, they all lock their shields together. And that's what they would do. Here's what, these guys were professional military people. They didn't want to die, and they knew that their guy next to them didn't want to die, so they were a unit. Any questions? 'Cause I made too much more quick here.
You wonder how the Jews and the Christians and the one empire lived together.
They didn't really live together. As Peter talked about, all of the rulers, here's what rulers would be replaced with the rulers. Who were distinct, not the Jews before Jews, but the wealthy people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the merchants. When they complained that a ruler was not being good, well, the Romans would replace them. Why? Because they didn't want to be old. So, it's kind of one of those things, if you live in an area where everyone is just as broke as you do this all together in your misery.
So the Roman Empire and Judaism was all one and the same?
Roman Empire and Judaism was one and the same, but Rome ruled over Judea.
So, when you said that they collect taxes,
Oh, yeah.
before the taxes went to the temple, I mean, the
Well,
Roman
that was the Jewish tax, based on the Mosaic law. So if you were a Jew, you had to pay additional. But that you had to pay first. So if you were a Jew in those days, you were taxed to the end of the earth. Because not only were you taxed by king, you were taxed by Rome proper, and you were taxed by your own religious system. That's why Jesus talked so forcefully against them. I mean, these Pharisees and Sadducees, religious leaders, they were rich. Why? Because they didn't have to work because they were spiritually dead. They all they did was endless rituals. And they were wealthy. And these people who brought all this stuff into the temple, they worked themselves to death.
Exempt from all religious taxes, number one.
Yeah, so you're kind of like sitting up there, and then you're saying, look how good I am. Look at I fasted, or look at I did this. And Jesus is saying, you really don't get it, do you? Here these people are poor, and you're worried about whether or not they picked an ear of corn to eat on the Sabbath. I guess you think they should have started with that. Because they broke your rule, but you're forgetting about people. And that was the challenge, is the Jewish culture, or the Jewish leaders were no different in the world.
I find it interesting too that when Jesus came to the world, it was a perfect time medically. There was leprosy that was coming, cancer for, and now we don't have it. We have, it would be a weird time to come here because we have so much medical superiority and variety, and we don't have people blind at the gates, you know.
Technology.
But God had to heal those people. He had to show His power.
Show who he was.
doesn't know the way that
He was able to fulfill the prophets and all that in the Old Testament and show people that he was done, that he was who he said he was.
Yeah.
Why? Because only God can do those things. Now, here's what God still does, he just uses medical science. It's not any different now. Because all medical science, all these things that they come up with, they don't come up with unless God says come up with it. So.
Steve, was it like the Sanhedrin that set the taxes, those religious taxes?
That was based on the Mosaic Law. So they adhered to the Mosaic Law.
That was part of the Mosaic Law.
Oh, yeah. And when you look through the book, Ruth has all the scriptures that will show where this tax comes out of Leviticus. This one here numbers all these taxes. And here's what, it was probably great when Israel was thriving and they were obeying God and he was giving their land abundance and all this stuff. Here's what, when they turned and then all this stuff, and then they invited Rome in, because they invited Rome in. And then they got the taxes, upon taxes, upon taxes.
When Paul was killing the Christians, were they already called Christians?
Yes.
I don't know the exact date that they were called Christians, but they were followers of the way, I guess you would call them. Christ followers, but.
Christian is mentioned twice in the Bible.
Christian is only mentioned once in the Bible.
Really?
And it refers to, I think the verse is, and they were first called Christians at Antioch. That's the one time the word Christian is used in the Bible.
And I wonder too, if Paul was that educated and that well trained in the Torah, how did he miss it that Jesus was the Messiah?
The same way you and I missed it before we knew Christ was the Messiah.
Yeah. Blind out.
Because unless a man be born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So Paul, despite all of his intelligence, was just as blind as everybody else. And that's why when we look at the Roman Empire, and we say, you know, like Steve said, oh, are you describing Rome or are you describing the United States? When man is in man's fallen state, he can accomplish great things, but they're greatly depraved because they're always going to cascade downhill. You look at Augustus as a great emperor and trying to do these great things, yet he still had all these pockets where he was corrupt, and it cascaded downhill because that's what man does. Our fallen nature falls downhill.
We're fallen and we can't get up.
We can't get up.
You know, it's all a result of it's iniquity. And my favorite definition in the NIV dictionary of iniquity is perversion of the heart and wickedness of purpose.
And that's why.
That's iniquity, which is the same thing as sin.
Legislators couldn't see it, because you can't see the things of God. The things of God are spiritually discerned. But, here's one great thing. Once Paul met Christ on the road to Damascus, everything that he had learned made sense. So, he becomes, from Paul, the one who persecutes Christians because he thinks he knows everything, to Paul that writes all these treatises in the New Testament, Romans, and understanding, law and grace and forgiveness and all these things, because now everything that had been in the Judaism, types of Christ, and all these things made sense. Because now he had the reference point. Because, society always likes to say everything's relative. Well, everything is relative. It's all relative to God, who is everything. If you want to make it relative to something else, well, then you're going to go down a false thing. Everything is relative and everything relates to God. It all begins and ends with God. Nothing exists that does not. That doesn't mean we don't have depravities and we don't corrupt it.
Well, it's a good point that you said that when Paul met Christ, everything that he had learned made sense. Because when reading the scripture, it's hard to imagine that Paul was a Jew.
Yep.
But I think that's why it's important that we know the Jewish roots of Christianity and how Jewish people think.
Because then you can understand when Paul's writing Romans, or when Paul's writing Galatians, or he's speaking to Timothy, he's taking all this understanding that he had through all this training. And he's saying, this is what it means in Christ. Because that was just a shadow. It was kind of a building up to this revelation. And that's, not that, you're not diminishing Peter and James, because those were the ones that worked among their brethren. But Paul was called to take to the Gentiles because he understood that world. I mean, it's likely that some of the other apostles had never been out of Judea.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a poor fisherman, how are you going to go anywhere? I mean, let's get in our boat and go somewhere. Yeah, it's an inland sea. I can go from one side to another, but I'm still in Judea. It's not like he's Columbus and says, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to find this new world.
Hebrews are not. Hebrews are Jews.
All games on.
Does
anyone want to score? This is loaded. Bottom of the fifth.
Okay, Adela is giving me that we need someone to sign up.
Need 3 more people to sign up. One more for next week.
We're going to finish up
Next week?
next 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's
We can
fine.
start. I forget what the first day was.
Stop. That was the first week of November.
Yeah, I think it's the first. I think it is.
That's what
The
the
31st is Monday, right?
the first.
Yeah.
She said November
Next
1st.
Tuesday, the following Tuesday, for this class, and then the next class.